The stars over Neverland shimmered brighter than anywhere else in the world. They pulsed like fireflies, casting silver streaks across the sky, as if painting the night with magic. The island below was a paradise of endless adventure, or so the stories claimed. Alice had always dreamed of Neverland, a place where children never grew old, a place where laughter echoed through the trees, where mermaids whispered secrets beneath the moonlit waves, where Peter Pan soared through the clouds like a golden-haired guardian of youth. But when Alice arrived, it was not as she had imagined. The air smelled wrong, damp and metallic like rusting iron. The trees were too still, their twisted branches reaching like skeletal fingers. The water in the lagoon was black, thick as tar, and the mermaid's eyes glowed like hungry embers beneath the surface. Then she saw him. Peter. He floated just above the ground, his shadow twisting unnaturally beneath him. His smile was sharp, too sharp. His eyes, once bright with mischief, were empty, reflecting nothing but the night. "You made it," he whispered, voice smooth as silk. Alice took a step back, her heart hammering. Something in the air shifted. The stars above seemed dimmer now, as if something vast and unseen was swallowing the light. Peter's grin widened. "Welcome to Neverland," he said, tilting his head. "You can never leave." Alice had always believed in magic. She had grown up listening to bedtime stories about Neverland, a place where children never had to grow up, where adventure never ended, and where Peter Pan was the eternal guardian of joy and mischief. But reality had never been as kind as the stories. Alice's childhood had been lonely, moving from foster home to foster home, never staying long enough to make real friends. She used to whisper to the stars at night, wishing Peter Pan would find her, that he would take her away to his island where she could finally belong. And one night, he did. She had woken to the sound of tapping against her window. At first, she thought it was the wind, but then she heard a voice, soft, inviting, familiar. "Alice, come with me." The window creaked open, and there he was. Peter Pan, just as the stories described, golden-haired, dressed in green, floating effortlessly outside, the moonlight painting his features in a glow almost too perfect. It had felt like a dream. She barely remembered stepping forward, barely remembered taking his outstretched hand. Then the world around her had blurred, and she was falling upward into the night sky, into a realm where the stars burned too bright and the air tasted of something old, like forgotten promises and dust-covered childhood dreams. Neverland. At first glance, it was everything she had imagined. Lush jungles sprawled beneath towering mountains, golden beaches kissed by emerald waves, and pirate ships frozen in time upon the glimmering sea. But as she looked closer, something was wrong. The trees were withered, their leaves curling at the edges like burnt paper. The wind didn't move the branches, they twitched on their own, as though responding to some invisible presence. The ocean, though glistening under the stars, carried no waves, its surface unnervingly still, like glass. And the lost boys. They stood in a half-circle around her, grinning. Their clothes were tattered, their skin too pale, their eyes dark and hollow, as if something had drained the light from within them. Peter landed beside her, his shadow twisting strangely beneath him, never quite aligning with his movements. "You're home now, Alice," he said softly. Home. The word sent a shiver down her spine. Peter gestured toward the jungle, where a barely visible path snaked through the trees. "Let's go, there's so much to show you." Alice hesitated. The jungle felt like it was watching her. She turned toward the beach, where an old, broken ship loomed against the horizon. Its torn sails hung lifeless, as if abandoned for centuries. A thick mist curled around its base, shifting like something alive. What about the pirates? Alice asked. Peter's expression darkened for the briefest second, just a flicker, gone too fast to be sure she had seen it. There are no more pirates, he said, his voice light but his eyes unreadable. Something in the distance let out a soft wailing sound. Alice stepped backward. Maybe I should go back. Peter's smile didn't fade, but something in it stiffened. There's nowhere else to go. Alice turned toward the sky, expecting to see the second star to the right, expecting to see the way home. But there was nothing. Just an endless, black void stretching far beyond the horizon. A creeping cold settled into her bones. Neverland wasn't just an island. It was a trap, and she had just walked into it. Alice followed Peter and the lost boys through the jungle, her footsteps hesitant as the eerie silence of Neverland pressed in around her. The trees stretched too high, their branches curling unnaturally, twisting toward her as if reaching for something unseen. The deeper they went, the darker the sky became, the once bright stars fading into a hazy, suffocating mist. And the lost boys. They laughed and ran ahead, but there was something wrong with them. Their clothes looked older now, as if time had forgotten them entirely. Their skin had a grayish tint, and when Alice looked closely, she swore their shadows didn't move right, jagged, unnatural things stretching in the wrong directions. She tried to ignore the feeling clawing at her chest. "Where exactly are we going?" she asked, forcing her voice to stay steady. Peter, who had been floating just ahead, glanced back at her, his eyes too bright, his smile too wide. "To play," he said simply. Alice swallowed. "Play what?" The lost boys giggled, the sound carrying an edge of something shrill, almost pained. "You'll see," one of them whispered. The jungle soon opened up to a clearing, and Alice stopped short, her breath catching. At the center stood a massive tree, its bark blackened and split. A crude door had been carved into it, jagged and wrong, like something had ripped into the wood rather than cut it. The lost boys ran ahead, disappearing through the entrance one by one, their laughter echoing like distant, warped music. Peter hovered just outside the door, his golden hair shimmering under the dim light. "After you," he said. Alice hesitated. Something deep in her bones screamed not to step inside. "What's in there?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Peter's head tilted. His shadow flickered, jerking unnaturally beneath him. "Home." Alice's pulse pounded in her ears. Slowly, she stepped forward, her fingers trembling as she touched the cold, splintered wood. With a deep breath, she stepped inside. The inside of the treehouse was not what she expected. She had imagined something cozy, a warm fire, soft blankets, an endless supply of sweets, just like in the stories. Instead, the room was empty. Cold. Rotten wood stretched out before her, the walls covered in deep scratches, like something had tried desperately to escape. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the only source of light came from a row of tiny, flickering lanterns hanging from the ceiling. At the far end of the room, Alice spotted beds. At least she thought they were beds. Thin, brittle mattresses lay across the floor, each covered in a thin layer of dust. The sheets were stained, dark, crusted patches soaking into the fabric. Alice's stomach twisted. She turned to Peter, who had not moved from the doorway. "Where are the others?" she whispered. Peter just smiled. Alice's breath hitched. She turned quickly, looking around. The lost boys had gone completely silent. Then, from the shadows, a voice whispered, "Help us!" Alice's heart stopped. She spun around, but there was no one there. Only the empty, rotting room. Another whisper slithered through the air, distant and aching. "Run!" The lanterns flickered violently. The room shuddered, the very walls seeming to breathe. Alice stumbled back toward the door, her fingers trembling as she reached for the splintered frame. Peter moved suddenly, his body flickering like a glitching shadow. He was in front of her now, his face inches from hers, his smile unnaturally wide. "Stay, Alice," he murmured. "You belong here." Alice let out a shaky breath. "I want to go home." Peter's eyes darkened. "There is no home," he whispered. "Not anymore." Behind him, the lanterns died, plunging the room into darkness. And then the whispering turned into screams. The screams filled Alice's head, echoing from the walls, shrill and layered, as if the very fabric of Neverland was crying out. She stumbled backward, her pulse hammering against her ribs. The air had changed, thick and suffocating, pressing against her like invisible hands. The walls twitched, the wood beneath her feet groaning as if alive. And Peter was no longer smiling. His golden hair, once radiant in the dim light, had darkened into something ashen and lifeless. His eyes, wide and hollow, seemed to swallow the light, leaving only an endless, abyssal blackness. "You still don't understand, do you?" he murmured, his voice layered. Two voices speaking at once, one his usual sing-song tone, the other something deeper, ancient, inhuman. Alice tried to step back, but shadows surged up from the floor, curling around her ankles. They were cold. So cold. "Peter," she whispered, "what is this place?" Peter's head tilted at an unnatural angle, his bones cracking as he moved. "This is where lost children go." Alice's breath hitched. She turned to the bunk beds, to the faint outlines of figures beneath the sheets, still, unmoving. Not beds. Graves. Alice clamped a hand over her mouth. The stench of rot was stronger now, seeping from the cracks in the floor from the very walls themselves. The lost boys were never alive. They were trapped here, echoes of children who had believed in the wrong Peter Pan. Peter took a step closer. His shadow stretched unnaturally, shifting along the walls like a living thing. "You wish for me, Alice," he said, his voice soft. Too soft. Her throat was too tight to respond. He smiled again, that horrible, hungry smile. "I answer." Alice's chest clenched with terror. She bolted. Her feet slammed against the wooden floor as she lunged for the door, but the moment she reached for it, it vanished, melting into the shadows. A sharp, childish giggle whispered in her ear. She spun. Peter was right behind her, his head cocked to one side, his teeth too sharp, his fingernails lengthening into claws. "There's no way out," he whispered. Alice's breath came in ragged gasps. She forced herself to think. If Neverland was a trap, then there had to be a way to break it. What was different? She looked at Peter, at the twisting darkness where his shadow should be. And suddenly, she understood. It wasn't his shadow. It was Neverland's. The island itself was alive, and Peter was its puppet. Her gaze darted to the lanterns above, their glow barely flickering now, as if on the verge of being snuffed out completely. Light. She needed light. Her hands flew to her pockets. Nothing. No flashlight, no matches, no phone. Nothing. Her heart pounded. Think! Think! Then she remembered. The stars. She had arrived here through the second star to the right. If she could find the sky again, find even one glimmer of light, she might have a chance. But Peter was moving closer, his limbs jerking like a marionette, his fingers twitching in the air like he could already feel her soul slipping from her skin. "I won't let you leave," he whispered. Alice clenched her fists. She looked upward. There. A crack in the ceiling, faint but visible, a sliver of night sky. And beyond it, the stars still burned. Without hesitating, she ran straight for the wall. Peter lunged. The shadows snapped at her heels. She jumped, hands grasping for the rotting wood, scrambling upward as the floor shuddered violently beneath her. Peter screamed, a raw, inhuman sound, his shadow splintering into 100 writhing tendrils. The other voices wailed, the ghosts of the lost boys, the whispers of every child who had ever been lured here and forgotten. Alice didn't look back. She reached for the stars. Her fingers touched light. And then, Neverland shattered. A rush of freezing air tore through the darkness as Alice's fingers brushed the starlight. Neverland let out a scream, not Peter, not the lost boys, but the island itself, a terrible hollow wail that echoed in the spaces between reality. The world around her splintered, the rotting wood beneath her fingers disintegrating into dust. For a single breathless moment, she felt herself falling. Then, light. Soft, cold, familiar. Alice's eyes fluttered open. She was lying on grass, damp with morning dew. A crisp wind carried the scent of pine and earth, and above her, the sky stretched in endless, untouched blue. No stars. No Neverland. Just the real world. She sat up too quickly, her head spinning. The edges of her memory felt like they had been scrubbed raw, as if the dream was already fading, slipping through the cracks of waking consciousness. Had it been a dream? She touched her arm, expecting warmth, but her skin was cold, the same unnatural chill that had clung to her in Peter's shadow. Slowly, she turned. Behind her, there was no sign of Neverland. No jungle, no lost boys, no monstrous shadow lurking in the corners of her vision. Only the edge of the forest that bordered her family's cabin. Her home. But something wasn't right. A whisper of wind curled around her, and for the briefest moment, she swore she heard laughter, high-pitched and childlike, drifting on the breeze. Alice's hands clenched. She turned sharply, scanning the trees. Nothing. And yet, the shadows between the branches seemed too deep. Her pulse quickened. Slowly, hesitantly, she took a step backward, then another. The wind stilled. The forest watched her. Then, from the darkness, something moved. Just for a second. A flicker of gold. a too wide smile, and a voice, soft, familiar, and waiting. "Come back, Alice." The wind howled, the trees shuddered, and the morning sun suddenly felt too dim. Alice turned and ran. Neverland was not a dream. It was still watching, still waiting, and it was only a matter of time before it found another lost child. Alice never spoke about what happened that night. She told herself it was just a nightmare, a trick of the mind, until the whispers returned. Until she saw the golden-haired boy in the reflection of her window, watching from the darkness with that same knowing smile. Until one night, she woke to find her shadow missing. And from the farthest corner of the room, Peter whispered, "You left once, Alice, but no one ever truly escapes Neverland."